Okay, in this part we are going to take a look at how we can set this model up and get it ready for sculpting inside of ZBrush. Actually, this is where we are going to start some sculpting of the torso area. So we've already set up the image plane. We've also got this extra little part we're not going to spend too much time on for the rib hip proxy. But what I'm going to do right now mostly is go in with a move brush. I've got transparency on, and I'm just going to adjust the contours. I'm eyeballing some of this because the reference is going to have either proportion or perspective distortion or something like that. And at the end of the day, I'm responsible for the sculpt, so I need to, make my own decisions. Now, this curve that I put in right here is very important to keep in mind. The up plane for the chest, then you have this, and then you have the up plane for the abdomen, and then back. And that has everything to do with his posture. But if I'm going to get that right, I need to make sure that I've put it in there in the base mesh before I start sculpting the anatomy on there. So just using the move brush at this point. And let's just speed this up a touch. I want to get it to a point where I'm going to start to divide it many times up to, at this point 300, we're at 2 million now, or 1.2 million. And I'm going to set this up with poly painting so that I can get in there and actually just make some anatomical notes on the sculpt. So real quick, how I set that up is that I would go to the, make sure the tool's selected, then I'll go to the color swatch, and I'll set my color to white over here, and then I'll go to the color palette and make sure that I select fill object. Once I do that, then my model is primed for poly painting, and I can just get going from there. Then I select black on the in the color swatch, make sure that up here at the top I've turned Z-add off so that I'm not sculpting, and then just paint away. Now, in terms of anatomical landmarks, the things to keep in mind are that, one, the iliac crest is really important. The sartorius is also very important to me, and the arch of Apollo for the rib cage is another one that's very important. The other one that I make sure I put in there is the pit of the neck and the clavicle. So those points are going to really help me keep this model kind of positioned. Line of the tibia is also very useful, and just a brief suggestion for the knees. Looking at this now, my line, arch of Apollo is a bit low, but I end up fixing that later on. And so very important to do this from a side view as well, and you want to be keeping in mind, the external oblique and how the external oblique is kind of coming in around and wrapping up. Really coming up and wrapping it about right here. And then this is all going to be rib cage, but what they end up doing together is they end up creating this nice flow. Just going to hide those arms. You can learn more about how I hid those arms in the subtool and polygroup part of this lecture. But right now what I'm doing is a very key thing and very important. So what I'm doing right now is establishing that the rib cage is going to flow this way, but then there's going to be a divot, and then the abdomen is going to start from there. So I'm really establishing the fact that the rib cage is going to sit on top, then there's going to be a down plane, and then an up plane, and then on from there. So I'm really wanting to make sure that the rib cage has the shape that it has, and that the abdomen is going backwards. Now also here as well, I'm making sure that if we take a look at our source, you see my iliac crest is right here. My external oblique is flowing back this way. The lumbar region is here. And then the external oblique is going to wrap around in this way. But I'm making sure that I make a clear distinction between where the external oblique is and then where the more skeletal aspect of the iliac crest and the more blocky square area for the hips. Great trochanter. Divot for the glutes. Just starting to put in little notes for the external oblique coming out the side. Start to round the rib cage. And just ignoring that pec for the moment. I'm turning colorize on and off so that it makes my life easier for seeing exactly where the surface is. And I do a lot of looking at the model from below. And that's really, really important because that's the only way that you're really going to get the draft of the model right. So you're going to want to be looking at it from below, from oblique angles, from above, things like that. Because that's where you'll really see if there's any problems in the structure. And so now I'm using the rake brush here. You can see that with clay tubes I came in and I suggested things and I would push the surface in, but then I really needed a brush that's going to really allow me to kind of slowly build up form and merge that form in. So I want to just be able to kind of keep this nice even tone. Rake brush is what really does that really well. Press Alt, push in. Let's speed this up a little bit. One thing that I really want to also emphasize here is how I'm keeping things blocky. So notice how there is really just one flat plane here. The external oblique is coming in and then wrapping in this direction. And it has a very specific softness to it, whereas when it reaches the hips, we're really talking about a cube in space. Just speeding this up a little bit, adding some bulk in there for the pecs. Checking my reference. Trying to find out where that lat is coming into and going to. and make sure that I sculpt that, pretty accurately. And really, in order to do it, I need to make sure that I get the armpit in there. So, also this line of the rib cage right here in the back. So you can see the external oblique coming up, reaching in, and then it gets continued by this line of the rib cage and meeting our lumbar column. And one of the cool things to note is how this creates a very specific wedge shape right here, as well as the wedge shape for the lat here, the external oblique on the other side, and on from there. But if you look for these 2D shapes, you're going to be in much better shape when it comes time to sculpting, because you'll be able to just pick them out really fast. So checking out my reference, trying to see where things are. So here I'm looking at the wedge shape here. I'm also looking at how the lat is coming in here, and I'm just trying to get that in position. Also, I'll note later on how this gets this line of the lat gets continued down to the sacrum. But I'm also trying to find where this line right here gets picked up right in here. And I want to make sure that I'm able to see that and understand that, because that's going to help me from the front view and the side view get things positioned properly. So there I am putting the line of the ribs. Just using the mask to just make a little note to myself. And using the rake to just pressing Alt to just carve it in. Really, really smooth brush for doing this kind of stuff. I just love the surface that it creates. Let's speed this part up just a touch. Make sure that the sacrum area is well covered. So we're close. Torso looks kind of nice, but I need to really be thinking about the shoulder region, making sure that that has the correct shape to it as well. So I'm really going to go in and be looking at what's going on here in my reference. Part of the problem I'm going to experience is that I'm just not going to have reference for the exact shape that I want. But I'm going to have enough. So if we look at this, one thing that you'll see I've drawn on the mesh is this straight boxy line. And that's something my teacher Al Gurry would always emphasize. If you create this plane right here, it's just really a solid plane, then it's going to really help you understand the anatomy of that shoulder area a little bit better. Plus, we can then use that plane and bisect it with the deltoid, the lats coming in like that, all these individual muscles which become a part of the process. But you have to have that plane in place for that to happen first. So here I've done it. Deltoid, and then on from there, and the trapezius. But having the 2D shape is really useful. Put the 7th cervical vertebrae up here in the top. It's essential. So you can see there's definitely 2D drawing elements to this, so it's very important to learn anatomy from a 2D drawing perspective. But sculptors have a much tougher job. They've got to be able to draw this from not just one angle, but every angle. and not necessarily draw it on paper, but draw it inside their mind, be able to know how these things interact. So in a lot of ways, you're like a mechanical engineer of a very complex piece of anatomy, very complex machine. So putting in the deltoid, just speeding all this up. And really important as well is creating this line for the shoulder girdle that starts at the pit of the neck. It's going to come in, basically represent the clavicle. Then this is going to be matched by the spine of the scapula, which is then going to disappear around the back. But this entire area right here is just going to be a flat plane, so you really need to carve that out. You really need to make that a flat plane, because there's just bone right there. No matter how big you get, you know, that area is going to be largely bone. Speed this up as well. Putting the neck in there, and you can see lots of carving in. And at the end of the day, when it comes to the neck, the most important thing for me is that I have a cylinder shape for the neck, and then I also have just kind of like a flat plane for the shoulders. So you can see I'm really making a strong distinction right here. So that is very separate from what then comes out of there and comes and wraps around this way. Alright, definitely in this shoulder area, I realized that I have to just push this area between the shoulder and the pec way back. Also get that S curve of the clavicle, which I kind of started to miss out on. But I really need to make sure that from this top view, the clavicle is coming back like that. Spine of the scapula, and on from there. And then the scapula comes down. So all of that really needs to be in play. Using the clay brush to just push it in. Using topological masking to isolate an arm. And so here now I'm really just taking up one of my references and trying to understand where everything's going, where I want to be pulling the humerus from. So here we've sculpted the clavicle, spine of the scapula, the humerus, and now I'm just kind of outlining the muscles flowing into it. So of primary importance to me here is the fact that there is the shoulder area, which is basically this cube right in this area, which is going to then go back in space, back in this direction. But that's going to then meet up with this oval in this area. But I need to create a very strong distinction between this edge of the box and on from there. So let's just whiz past some of this. Just going to move that arm forward a bit. And the next thing that I really want to do is just establish the blocky nature of the shoulder. So I'm going to go in with clay or move and just kind of make sure that that has a front plane, a side plane, and a back plane. So that's really kind of key for me to make sure that the shape is there in the best possible way. So you can see right here, you know, there is the side plane, the front plane is shooting off here, and the back plane off there. and we have a top plane already in place. And those are the things that we need to make sure are there so that when we add the geometry or add the individual shapes, they all kind of hang in the right place. So just going to carve that clavicle back a bit and then get in there and start working that angle. Going to flatten the plane for that bicep. Start to put some suggestion of the tricep there in the back. Flatten the side of the bicep as well. And there's just more sculpting to be done from this point on. But what I just want to be very clear about is, how we're using, or how I'm using the clay brush to get in there and start to plane the surface and suggest the overall shape of things. If it's a box, make it a box, and then go in with the rake brush, like I'm doing right now, and round the surface and create more of the individual. More of the unique characteristic of it. So you're working from very simple shapes, simple primitives such as a box, to more complex curvature. And then final thing I'll point out about this process is how, as you see when I start working on the arm, the arm really started to facet. Even though I was at that time a pretty high polygon level, and that's where it really became obvious to me that I needed more polygons in there. So more sculpting from here, but I want to move on to other topics, and I hope you enjoyed this part.